The sky was weeping when Richard Mayfield was laid to rest. Gray clouds loomed above the cemetery, casting long shadows over the fresh grave. Raindrops tapped on umbrellas like faint whispers of unfinished conversations. Catherine stood near the headstone, her black coat clinging to her in the damp wind, her eyes dry but hollow. Beside her, Emma held a crumpled tissue, her sobs soft and broken like a child's. Richard had been many things: stern, disciplined, powerful. He was a man who rarely smiled, who measured affection in achievements, not words. To the world, he was a tycoon; to his family, a fortress. And like a fortress, he'd kept many things hidden behind thick, impenetrable walls. The funeral was simple but dignified, just as he would have wanted. No grand speeches, no performances. Just closure, or so everyone thought. A week later, the Mayfield estate buzzed with tension. The Grand Manor, nestled in the Connecticut countryside, was as cold as ever. Walls lined with family portraits, antique mirrors, and silent secrets. It was here, in the sprawling library with its mahogany shelves and fireplace, that hadn't been lit in years, that the family gathered to hear Richard's will. Catherine sat upright in the leather armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was every bit her father's daughter. Sharp, commanding, unreadable. Emma, on the other hand, looked fragile, her wide green eyes darting nervously around the room. Their mother, Diane, stood behind them, her expression unreadable. Time had not aged her gently. She wore a high-collared dress, her hands folded neatly, like a woman preparing for war. Also present were the family lawyer, Mr. Vernon Clark, and two witnesses. Clark, a silver-haired man with deep, set eyes, cleared his throat and opened the thick leather folder in his hands. As per the wishes of Mr. Richard Mayfield, he began, "I will now read the final testament and distribute the estate accordingly." There was a pause. A long, uncomfortable silence that filled the room like smoke. Then he continued. "To my daughter Catherine, I leave the majority of my shares in Mayfield Industries, the waterfront property in Cape Cod, and the family vault account at McKinley & Sons. You have always been the strongest of them all." Catherine blinked, absorbing the words, but her face remained stone. "To my daughter Emma." Clark hesitated. "I leave my personal collection of first edition books, and the contents of the Montclair safe deposit box." Emma's brows furrowed. It was a thoughtful gesture, but a small one compared to Catherine's inheritance. Emma shifted in her seat, confusion lining her features. "And finally," Clark said, now reading more slowly, "before any further execution of the will can proceed, I request, as my last directive, that a paternity verification be conducted on all my children, namely, Catherine and Emma Mayfield. Only upon confirmation of biological lineage shall the will be honored." The room fell into stunned silence. The fireplace crackled, the only sound in the room as the weight of Richard's words settled like a stone dropped into deep water. "A DNA test," Catherine said finally, her voice low, cautious. Clark nodded. "Yes, the will is clear. A legally supervised paternity test must be conducted within 30 days of this reading. The results will determine eligibility for inheritance." Emma's face went pale. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes darted to her mother, who stood rigid, her face as white as the snow that began to fall softly outside the tall windows. "But why would he ask for this?" Emma whispered, barely audible. "Why now? He never doubted us. He never said anything." Diane cut in quickly, her voice sharp. "Your father was always paranoid. This is probably his way of controlling things, even after death." But her words felt forced, and even Emma noticed it. Catherine turned in her chair to face her mother fully, eyes narrowed. "Mom, is there something we should know?" Diane shook her head, too quickly. "Of course not. This is ridiculous. Richard loved you both. Loved us enough to question whether we were his." Catherine replied coldly. Emma stood up, her voice shaking. "I don't want to do this. This is insane. He's gone, and now we're being made to. What, prove we're his children like some test animals? You don't have a choice?" Clark interjected, his tone professional but firm. "If the test is not completed, you forfeit your rights under the will. That's the legal reality." Catherine remained seated, thoughtful. Her mind was racing. Had she seen any signs of suspicion from her father? Any offhand remarks, moments of hesitation? No. At least, not toward her. But Emma, he'd always been kind to her, perhaps even indulgent. But now Catherine couldn't help but wonder if that kindness had been laced with doubt. Emma looked toward her sister, desperate for reassurance. Katie, you don't think this is about me, do you? Catherine hesitated just a moment too long. Emma's face crumpled. She turned and left the room in silence. Diane watched her go, but didn't follow. Her hands trembled at her sides. That night, the manor was quiet. The sisters barely spoke. Emma locked herself in her room, while Catherine stood outside on the balcony, staring into the woods beyond the estate. Snow covered the trees like secrets, soft and silent. Catherine thought of their childhood. The way Emma had always looked a little different. Her hair lighter, her nose more delicate. She remembered once hearing a visitor say, "You don't look much like your sister, do you?" And how Diane had laughed it off. Now it all seemed too convenient. She turned to go inside, her breath misting in the cold. Downstairs, Diane sat alone in the dim kitchen, a glass of untouched wine before her. Her reflection in the glass was warped, like her memories. She thought about the summer of 1989, the year before she married Richard. The secret she thought she'd buried forever was clawing its way back to the surface. In the silence, she whispered to herself, "I should have told them." A cotton swab, a signature on a form, and a brief appointment at a cold, sterile clinic just outside the city. But no one felt simple afterward. The ride back to the estate was silent. Catherine drove, her hands tense on the steering wheel, her jaw locked. Emma sat beside her, arms crossed tightly, staring out the window as raindrops streamed past like the ghosts of things unsaid. They hadn't spoken much since the reading of the will, and now that the test was done, the silence between them felt heavier, almost suffocating. Every glance, every breath carried the weight of suspicion. Catherine hated it. Emma felt it. Back at the manor, Diane paced the hallway like a trapped animal. She hadn't left the house since the funeral, and her calm mask was starting to crack. The creases around her eyes deepened, her once perfectly composed demeanor unraveling with each passing hour. Guilt clung to her like perfume worn too thick. Emma walked through the front door without a word, and climbed the stairs to her room. Catherine stood in the foyer a moment longer, watching her mother. "You've been quiet," Catherine said finally. Diane turned slowly, eyes bloodshot. "There's nothing I can say, Katie, and your father is dead, and now the whole world is turning upside down." Catherine stepped forward, her voice sharp. "It's not the world that's upside down. It's our family. And you know something. You've known something all along." Diane stiffened. "You're letting grief make you paranoid." "No," Catherine replied calmly. "Dad was paranoid. I'm observant." For a moment, Diane looked like she might confess. Her lips parted, her eyes flickered with something like fear. But then, she looked away. "When the results come back," Catherine said, "I hope you're ready." 3 days later, they arrived. 2 identical white envelopes. 2 names. Catherine waited until Emma came downstairs before she opened hers. Emma had barely slept. The dark circles under her eyes betrayed a mind trapped in endless spirals of dread. Mr. Clark had returned to the manor for the occasion. The official execution of the will could not proceed until the truth was on paper. Catherine unfolded her document with a calm face. Her eyes scanned it quickly. Probability of paternity, 99.999%. She felt her stomach relax, not from joy but from the confirmation of something she already knew. Her father had always been hers. She folded the paper again, lips pressed into a thin line, and turned to Emma. Emma's hands trembled as she tore open her envelope. She read it once, then twice. Her breath caught. A noise escaped her throat, a kind of cracked gasp that wasn't quite a sob. Then she dropped the paper. Catherine caught it before it hit the ground. She read the words. Probability of paternity 0%. The silence was like glass shattering. Emma backed away, shaking her head. No, that's wrong. That has to be wrong. Maybe they mixed something up, maybe the test. No mistake, Mr. Clark said solemnly. The test was verified by 2 independent labs, as your father required. Emma looked at her sister, her eyes wide and lost. Katie, please. Catherine couldn't speak. She felt as if the ground beneath her feet had tilted, as though she were standing on the edge of some great, invisible fault line. Mr. Clark cleared his throat, uncomfortable. I'm sorry, Miss Emma, but based on these results, you are not biologically Mr. Mayfield's daughter. The will's stipulation is clear. You are ineligible for inheritance. Emma sat down slowly on the velvet chaise in the center of the library, as if her legs could no longer support her. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. "Then who am I?" she whispered. Diane, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward. For the first time in weeks, her mask fell completely away. She looked old. Broken. "You're my daughter," Diane said quietly. Emma didn't look at her. But not his. "No. Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice rose. "You let me live my whole life thinking I was his child. You let him, what, raise me, love me, and all this time you knew the truth." "I was scared," Diane replied, tears spilling over. "I thought he would leave me. I was pregnant when I met him. Barely a few weeks. He assumed you were his. I didn't correct him. And then it was too late. You were born, and he loved you, Emma, even if he didn't say it often." "He did." Emma stood now, fire in her eyes. "No. He didn't love me. He put a DNA test in his will. That's not love. That's suspicion. That's spite. He knew, didn't he? He knew I wasn't his." Diane said nothing. The silence was its own confession. That night, Catherine found Emma sitting alone in the backyard garden, shivering despite the thick sweater she wore. The garden had been Richard's pride. Manicured hedges, rose arches, perfectly aligned stone pathways. But now it felt like a graveyard of memories. Catherine walked up quietly and sat beside her. Emma didn't look at her. "It's strange," she said. "I used to love this place. I used to think of it as home. Now it feels like a stranger's yard." "You didn't deserve this," Catherine said softly. Emma laughed bitterly. "Didn't I? Maybe this is karma. Maybe I lived a life that wasn't mine. Took a name that wasn't mine. Loved a man who wasn't my father and called him that every day." "You were a child. It wasn't your lie." Emma finally looked at her. "Do you think he hated me? All this time?" Catherine's heart twisted. She remembered moments, glances, the way Richard sometimes hesitated when Emma hugged him, how he was never quite as hard on her as he was with Catherine. "No," Catherine said. "I think he wanted to believe you were his. But in the end, he couldn't die without the truth." Emma looked away, her voice barely a whisper. "Well, now I have the truth. And nothing else." The next morning, Emma packed her bags. Diane tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. She left without saying goodbye to anyone but Catherine. Before she walked out the door, she handed her sister a note. Neat, folded, and trembling in her hands. "I'm going to find out who I really am," she said. "Not the name on a will. Not the story Mom fed us. I deserve that much." Catherine nodded. She didn't argue. As Emma disappeared down the long gravel driveway, a storm broke over the manor. Thunder rumbled in the distance. And inside the house, the cracks continued to grow. It had been 3 weeks since Emma left, and though Catherine had never been one for noise or chaos, the silence now felt different. Hollow, sharp, like the echo of something broken. Catherine wandered the halls at night, haunted not by ghosts, but by memories. Childhood birthdays. Family dinners. Her father sitting stiffly at the head of the table, Diane smiling a little too brightly. Emma, always softer, always radiant, always loved differently. She couldn't stop asking herself the same question. Had she missed it all along? Then came the phone call. Emma's voice on the line was cautious but resolute. She had traveled to Boston, where Diane had lived before meeting Richard. She had been digging through old hospital records, scouring public databases, searching for anything that might connect her to someone. Anyone. "I found a name," Emma said. "He was a law student. Mom was seeing him in the spring of '89. Catherine sat on the edge of her bed, heart pounding. "What's his name?" "James Calloway." The name meant nothing to Catherine, but Emma was already reading from a birth registry. "He moved out of state 2 years later. Never married. No kids. Except, maybe me." Catherine exhaled slowly. "Are you going to find him?" "I already did," Emma said. 3 days later, Boston. Emma stood outside a modest brick house in a quiet neighborhood. A dog barked in the distance. She stared at the door for what felt like an eternity, her hand hovering over the knocker. When the door finally opened, a tall man with graying hair and soft eyes stepped out. He was older now, but the resemblance was immediate. The same green eyes. The same half-smile. He froze when he saw her. "Emma," he said, as if he already knew. "You know who I am." Her voice wavered. "I recognize the name," James replied, his voice quiet. "Deanne sent me a letter after you were born. She said she was keeping you, and that she was marrying someone else." Emma felt tears gather behind her eyes. She never told me. Not once. I wanted to see you, James said, but she asked me to stay away. She said it was better that way, safer, more stable. Emma swallowed hard. Safer for who? James looked down. All I know is I let her go, and I've regretted it every day since. They sat for hours. He made her tea. Told her stories about who he had been, what kind of man he had tried to become. She listened, drinking in the pieces of herself that had always been missing. She left with a photo of him as a young man, and the strange but comforting knowledge that she hadn't come from nothing. Back at the manor, Catherine was unraveling a different thread. Unable to shake the feeling that the secrets ran deeper than just Emma's parentage, she began searching through Richard's old documents. She visited his study, left untouched since the funeral. Dust layered everything. Papers were still stacked as he had left them. A locked drawer in the desk caught her attention. The key was easy to find. Inside were letters, handwritten, hidden, yellowed with age. Not from Diane, from someone named Margot Vale. The earliest was dated February 1989. Richard, I know I should not write again, but I must tell you it's over. I can't keep doing this. I saw Diane with someone. She's pregnant, and it's not yours. Catherine's breath caught. There were more letters, each growing colder, more accusatory. Some hinted that Richard had suspected Emma wasn't his even before she was born. That he'd married Diane despite it. That he had hoped the child would still somehow be his. That he chose the lie, too. Catherine sank to the floor, overwhelmed. Her father had known. He had known all along. He'd raised Emma with deliberate distance, allowed her into the family with silent skepticism. He never confronted Diane, not openly. Instead, he'd waited. And then, in his death, he'd let the truth do the damage he hadn't had the courage to do himself. And Diane, she had lied to them both. That evening, Catherine confronted her mother. The tension in the living room was unbearable. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. You lied to all of us, Catherine said, holding the letters in her hand like a weapon. Dad knew, and you knew. And you both let Emma live in that house like she belonged when neither of you believed it. Diane's face was pale. I didn't know he kept those letters. You lied to her, to me, to him. Why? Diane stepped forward. Because I was scared. I was pregnant, alone, and ashamed. Richard offered me something James never could, a future, stability. And I told myself I could be a good wife, a good mother. That I could make him love Emma like his own. He didn't. Catherine snapped. He tolerated her. That's not love. He did, Diane whispered. In his own way. But he never forgave me. Not really. And Emma, she became the punishment I lived with every day. The words sank like stones in Catherine's chest. I never stopped loving her, Diane added, tears spilling freely. But I failed her. I failed you both. Catherine turned to leave. You lost both of us the moment you decided the lie was more important than the truth. Emma returned 2 days later. She was calmer, more composed, and somehow stronger. I met him, she told Catherine, my real father. He's kind, quiet, and he regrets leaving me. But I don't think he ever had a choice. Catherine nodded. I'm glad you found him. They stood together in the garden, the autumn leaves swirling around them. I don't want the money, Emma said. Not a cent. Let the Mayfield legacy rot in its own lies. Catherine looked at her. Then what do you want? Emma smiled faintly. Peace. Truth. A fresh start. She turned toward the manor. But before that, I think Mom needs to lose something too. Emma stood in front of the Mayfield manor once more, the morning sun low and gold behind her. She wasn't the same girl who had broken down in the library weeks ago. She wasn't the same girl who had begged for her sister's belief, or her mother's truth, or her father's love. That girl had died the day the DNA results arrived. The woman who walked up the front steps now had found herself in the ashes. And she had something to say. I'm not here for money, Emma told Mr. Clark, the family lawyer, sitting across from him in his office. But I want something added to the estate records. Something public. Clark raised an eyebrow. You're not legally a beneficiary. You don't have standing to. I'm not asking for inheritance. She interrupted, calmly. I'm asking for an addendum of truth. My mother's deception. My father's knowledge. His choice to raise me anyway, and punish me in silence. I want the world to know the Mayfield legacy is built on a lie. Clark hesitated. Why? Why do that to the family name? Emma smiled faintly. Because the family name never included me. The memoir, Catherine, was the first to hear of the book. A small press in Boston. A title leaked through an anonymous submission. But Catherine knew that writing. Bloodline. The daughter who didn't belong. It was elegant, factual, and brutal. Emma had changed the names. Barely. But anyone who knew the Mayfields would know. The book spared no detail: the affair, the fake marriage, the distant father, the truth buried for decades. Catherine read the entire manuscript in one night, her hands shaking. She didn't stop her sister. She didn't warn Diane. She knew this reckoning was long overdue. Diane's fall, it hit the newspapers first. Then social media. Then the family name. Within a week, Diane Mayfield's long, standing seat on several charity boards was revoked. Interviews she had lined up for a memoir of her own were cancelled. Worse, the estate's reputation plummeted. Clients of Mayfield Industries began to quietly withdraw. Stocks fluttered. Former friends stopped answering calls. But Diane, she sat alone in the manor, surrounded by the artifacts of a lie she'd curated for 3 decades. She watched her empire bleed. And she never heard from Emma again. Catherine's choice. Catherine stood at her father's grave one morning, the leaves damp with rain around her feet. He knew, didn't he? She whispered. He just didn't have the courage to confront it. So he let Emma grow up thinking she was loved, while treating her like a stranger. She wiped away a tear she didn't remember shedding. I thought you were cold, but I thought you were fair. I was wrong. Behind her, a soft voice spoke. You weren't the only one. And Emma stepped forward, hands in her coat pockets. They stood together in silence, watching the headstone. I'm not here to forgive him, Emma said. But I think I've punished him enough. Catherine looked at her. And Mom. Emma shrugged. She'll live with the fallout. That's enough. She turned to leave but paused. I don't want your money, Katie. Or your name. But, I hope someday, I'll have your respect. You already do, Catherine said quietly. You always did. A New Beginning. Months later, the book was a bestseller. Not because it was scandalous, but because it was honest. People related to the pain of family lies, the hunger for identity, the slow rebuilding of self. Emma changed her last name. She bought a small cottage on the coast. She taught writing to young girls who had been lied to, abandoned, or silenced. She told them, the truth doesn't have to destroy you. It can set you free, but only if you're brave enough to face it. One of her students asked, Did your family ever say sorry? Emma smiled sadly. No. But I did. Final lines. Catherine visited Emma every few months, always unannounced, always welcome. They didn't talk about the past anymore. They didn't need to. Revenge had come, not with anger, but with truth. And in that truth, Emma reclaimed her power, not with a fight, but with a story.